Welcome.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Let's get right into it. I was talking to my son, or actually my son started talking to me this week. We were sitting on the couch. He's 8, and he turned to me and said, if I'm counting, there'll always be another number. And does that mean that I can name the next number as we go towards infinity? And so in your book, Beyond Infinity, an expedition to the outer limits of mathematics, you talk about young children having what you call infinity instincts. Tell us about that, and is it possible that he can name the next number?
Anything is possible, almost. I love the fact that children feel things about infinity and get excited about it, but it's so difficult to understand what infinity is. And I think the gap between being able to think about infinity and being able to explain infinity is so huge. I think it's wonderful, and that's why I decided to write this book, because to me, that gap is a place where we can tell stories and discover things and have fun and see strange mathematical creatures. If there weren't such a big gap, then there'd be nowhere in which to do anything. And the fact that small children can get excited about it is great, because it means that they feel something about math. And unfortunately, many people only feel fear and hatred about math, and although that is something to feel, I'd rather people felt the things that I feel, which is excitement and amazement and curiosity and the feeling that enjoying the sense that you don't quite know what's going on. We can get very addicted to wanting to know things and wanting to be right. But actually, if we can enjoy not understanding things, then maybe we can enjoy math some more, because that process of not understanding something is how it all starts. And indeed, your son could possibly name the next number. Now, he can't invent the next number, but we do run out of names at some point, and I'm not quite sure what the biggest number is that has a name. I'm thinking there's quintillion, which maybe is 10 with 1 with 15 zeros on the end. Maybe there's a sextillion that I don't know. So maybe we can invent a new prize so that when children do really great in math, they get a new number named after them. It's like, your number is 1 with 85,000 zeros on the end of it. That's going to be called the Luke number.
That'd be great. The Chicago Humanities Festival, big idea right now is stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, how is infinity stuff?
That's a very interesting question. What is stuff, anyway? So I think that stuff is things that we don't quite distinguish from each other. And so I would say that you lovely people in this room, you're not stuff, you're people. And the chairs aren't stuff because they're all lined up neatly into rows and columns and things. But the things I have at home in my apartment, that's kind of stuff, because there's lots of it is not very organized. So the stuff that is the stuff, my possessions that are organized, I might not think of them as stuff. I don't think there are very many of those. But then there's this just stuff that we can't quite distinguish. And you might think that infinity is a load of stuff because it's a vast space that is filled with goodness knows what. What is infinite? Maybe is the universe infinite? Maybe there's just air is infinite? I don't know. And then it's not something that you can count or line up. And that's interesting to me, because the first kind of infinity that we mathematicians explore is what happens if you just count and keep going. So we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And if you keep going through all those numbers, there's an infinite number of them. And so that is an infinity, but it's a very organized infinity. It all lines up nicely one after another, like people who are in a neat, orderly queue, not people who are trying to board an airline, who are usually not in a neat, orderly queue. And so then the next kind of thing we can think about is if we include other numbers, if we include the fractions and the irrational numbers, that's the decimal numbers that go on forever without repeating themselves. And we discover that those numbers will not line up in an orderly queue. And that if you think you have lined them up in an orderly queue, there will always be one that turns out not to be there. Just like if I think I have organized all my possessions, there'll always be another one that turns out to just not be part of it, and I'll never be able to organize them all. And so the numbers that include the irrational numbers, those are called the real numbers, there's actually kind of more of them. And I might think of that as stuff, because they refuse to line up. And I quite like that about them. I don't like it when people don't line up well for the airplane, but I quite like the idea that these numbers are a bit subversive, and that they escape, and that you can't keep them contained. I like people who won't be contained in a line, and so that maybe is what stuff is. It's you kind of try and keep it contained, and it keeps popping out all over the place.
Well, and I teach middle schoolers, 7th and 8th graders, and I often try to talk about my math class as a way of us trying to better understand the world. And they come to me thinking math is a static thing, that it's like a set of content, it's like a noun. And they come to me directly from the class across the hall, which is called reading, which is something that you're doing, it's a verb. And so I oftentimes tell them, I think that we should start calling this mathing class, that we're doing something in this class. But that goes against their idea of that there should be like a right answer. And you just talked about things like popping out, and like how is that going to lead us to like the one thing that they want to put at the end and circle. In your book, Beyond Infinity, I was thinking about this passage that you wrote. You can get by perfectly well in life without understanding anything more about infinity than you did when you were 5 years old. But for me, the usefulness of mathematics isn't about whether you need it to get by in life or not. It's about how mathematical thinking and mathematical investigation sheds light on our thought process. Could you talk a little bit about how mathematical thinking is like a process?
I love the idea that we should think of math as a verb, and I think that math is really about thinking. It's not about numbers or equations, it's about thinking more clearly. And wouldn't it be better if more people in the world thought more clearly, especially at the moment? And people say to me, I get by perfectly well without math. And I say, yeah, maybe you do get by perfectly well without math, but I get by better. And, and that math is about thinking more clearly. And the thing about infinity is it's a great place to play around with trying to think clearly about something that we start feeling first. And math is something that begins with our instincts, actually. When mathematicians do new math, they start with something that they feel. And unfortunately, most of the feeling is removed from many school math classes, not the ones that you teach, obviously, and hopefully not the ones I teach either. I think some of my students are here, and maybe they can back me up on that. But we start by feeling something, and then we try to understand where that feeling is coming from. And we don't just try to squash it, but we try to understand. So is infinity a number that's bigger than everything else? Well, then we try and actually examine that using logic, which is a step that is often missing in discourse in the world. But we look at it and we say, where is this feeling coming from? If we actually try and back this up using logic, what happens? And then some strange things start happening. It goes a bit wrong, and then we have to refine our thinking in order to avoid those things that are going wrong. And one of the things I love about infinity is that there isn't just one right answer to what is infinity. And we can get very obsessed with wanting the right answer, and some people think that math is all about getting the right answer. And my art students often say to me that that's why they did not like it, because they're artists. They're not looking for the right answer. They want to explore possibilities. And what happens in math is that we construct different worlds in which different answers become possible, depending on what answer it is that we're trying to get to. And I think this has a big lesson for us in the world, because maybe there is something that we feel to be true, but we should examine why we feel it to be true and what would make it true, because maybe it's not true in this situation, maybe it's true in some other situation. And then we can very clearly separate out where our feeling is coming from, what basis it is starting from, what is the starting point of this thing, follow it through with the steps that take us to that particular ending point, and then see that a different ending point can arise in a different type of world from a different starting point, just like people feel different things. And it's not that they're wrong, it's that they've got some different starting point that they're coming from. Because we've all got different starting points, we've all come from different places in our lives, and we've gone on this journey. And in fact, mathematics is a journey. journey. And I try to tell it as a story that has a journey as well, that we start from somewhere and we go on this journey and that we see all sorts of things along the way. And if we tell it as a story, then we can see the excitement of that story and the fact that in order to get to infinity, what do we have to do? Maybe we have to climb some mountain. Maybe we have to swim through some ocean and we have to get seasick when things start getting really weird and we see some amazing creatures out there. Maybe there's some great creature and some really strange creature that may or may not exist. And these things are really exciting. And I think that if we bring out that story as we're going along, it becomes a process rather than just an answer.
The thing that you said in there that I was thinking about was this idea that we all start at a different place, and that so much about my teaching of mathematics to 7th and 8th graders comes to this idea of attending to precision. Be clear about how you're communicating. Be accurate in the way you communicate. And if we do that, we tend to understand each other better. In your book, you said, it can seem futile, dry, or pedantic to spend so long thinking about definitions of things, but I prefer to think of it as revealing. It reveals how the ideas work. Tell us about why it's important to think about definitions, but also how are ways that we may want to define infinity so that we can think about it.
It can sometimes seem pedantic when you talk about definitions, but how often do you get into an argument with someone about something and it all comes down to the fact that they're using language differently and that they're not fundamentally disagreeing? And at that point, I think it's really important to understand how we're using language. And mathematics, I like to think of it not as a subject, but as a discipline. It's a discipline for thinking clearly, and it's a discipline for trying to be as unambiguous as possible in our answers. Now, that doesn't encompass all of the world. Sometimes the beauty comes from ambiguity. The beauty comes from a piece of art that can be interpreted in many different ways. But math is looking for a particular kind of unambiguity. And so we are very clear about definitions, and we're very clear about how we take steps forward so that we can communicate with each other. And it means that we end up with ideas that are very, very transferable from one person to another. Of course, only if they also understand the language. And that's why when we communicate, communication is a two-way process. There's the communication that I send out, but there's also how it's being received. And so a radio station can broadcast radio as much as it wants. If no one's tuning in, then it's kind of futile. And the same is true when we're doing mathematics. We can make it very, very precise, and that means that we can give it to someone else, but only if they tune into it and understand what those precise things mean. And that's why I care so much about explaining this to everyone, because I wish we could all communicate better. I think there's a lot of communication problem. Maybe social media is the exact opposite of mathematics, because it is the worst possible communication, and the most possible misunderstandings arise. And I feel that as a mathematician, oddly enough, I can see very clearly where the misunderstanding is coming from, because I can see what each person is using as their form of justification. And because I can I try to separate out what the definition is, what the steps are that someone has taken, and separate out that from the feelings that we might have about it. That's a discipline where you separate the logic from the feelings. And it means that I can understand a lot. I feel like I'm very good at understanding why people think things, even if I profoundly and very vehemently disagree with what they're thinking. And I've now forgotten what question you asked me.
I think that you answered it very well.
Oh,
it
good.
was about this idea of communicating and how do we use definitions to help us do that. How is it that we then can use that idea of defining to help us understand infinity better?
Yeah, so it depends what you want infinity to be. And if you want infinity to be a number, you can make it a number. If you want infinity to be a place, you can make it a place. It makes the world a very strange kind of shape, and that's okay. And the great thing about math is that it doesn't have to obey the laws of the world, which is nice, because if you want to escape from the laws of the world, you have several choices. You can commit a crime. That's not advisable. You can sort of go into a dream world, and math is a dream world in which things can be true in that dream world. And although it's not the real world, dreams and fiction shed light on the real world. And one of my favorite examples of that with infinity is the literature and the fiction that's out there about immortality. And that we don't have immortality in life, but the fiction about immortality has taught me about life. And one of my favorite operas is the Macropolis Case by Janacek, in which one person is immortal. So everybody else is the same. And I think I talk about this in the book, the idea that you change one thing and you try to leave everything else the same and see what happens. And what happens in this opera is that we discover that immortality would be terrible, and that actually life gets its meaning from its finiteness. And so to me, that's an example of where something that isn't actually part of life sheds light on life. And thinking about infinity sheds light on the numbers that are not infinite, actually. And it was the drive to figure out infinity that led mathematicians finally to pin down what numbers really are. Because we use numbers all the time, but what are they actually? And people write probably whole PhD theses about what is the number 1? And that's not quite what I'm talking about, but even just logically, it turned out that mathematicians, no one really understood what numbers were. And once they did understand, they were getting by perfectly fine without knowing what numbers were, but then they understood it better, and then all sorts of things became possible. Electricity became possible, the internet became possible. Everything that we see around us uses calculus, actually, which only became possible when they understood infinity, the infinitely big and the infinitely small. And without that, where would we be? Well, we'd still be living in caves or something, and maybe some people would like that, but probably not you, because you're all here, so you're all enlightened people.
So, in my classroom, one of the things that I like to do is, as a math teacher, I bring in artists and art practice a lot. Recently, I had my students dance or create dance phrases to explain how transformations work. And I oftentimes think that the practice and the process of making art is very much like the practice and process of doing math. And you're at the Art Institute, and you teach students there. How has the working with artists and working at the Art Institute changed or affected how you think about mathematics?
Well, the first amazing thing is that I've become an artist myself, because I've been commissioned to make some art, and it's just been hung, mathematical art, at a new hotel downtown called Hotel EMC2, which is commemorating the intersection between art and science. And so I made 8 huge chalkboard panels about math and representing mathematical ideas. And honestly, for me, the process of making those panels felt exactly like the process of doing math, because I had some idea that I was trying to realize, and I needed to realize it using a slightly different language from usual, but the whole point of it was to communicate it to someone else. When we're doing mathematical research, we can have an idea and we can convince ourselves, and if I was a hermit in a cave or left on a desert island, I would leave it at that. I wouldn't bother writing a proof. I write the proof in order to communicate it with someone else. And so doing these chalkboard panels, the whole point was to communicate some mathematical idea to somebody else. And it felt like a tiny step away from the usual math that I do. And this is great because I teach art students at the School of the Art Institute. And so in order to teach them, I have thought really hard about what is it in math that could be relevant to artists. And of course, I think it's relevant to all humans as well, so there's that. But even inside art practice, the process of creativity is something that happens in art, and it happens in math as well. And so there are many things. I teach my first book, How to Bake Pie, and we talk about things like thought processes and the way that we go through thought processes. And if we can just understand what thought process we're using at any given moment, then it enables us to think more clearly because we can understand our own thought processes. And one of the reasons I love math, actually, that I did an event in DuPage this morning, and this little boy came up to me. He was about 5. He was very serious. He was very earnest. And he came up to me, and he wanted to meet me. And I said, "Oh, hi, do you like math?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What do you like most about math?" And he said, "I like it when it's hard, because then my brain grows." And I thought that was amazing. And what I love about math is that what we're doing is we're making our brain grow. Because the only tool we have when we're doing math is our brain. And for me, math is the purest form of just making our brain do more things. Well, there are other forms, okay? I can see various people in different fields here, but that it's a way of fine-tuning how our brain works. And our brain is the most amazing thing we have, I think. Our brain is the most powerful, it's all we have, it's the most powerful thing. Let's just pause for a moment to ponder how amazing our brains are. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to use it really, really well in these ways? And so that's what I say to my art students, that it's a way of thinking better. Doesn't everyone want to think better?
I think everyone wants to think better. I know I do. And as I read through the book, there were parts that I felt that challenged me, but it was so engaging in the way that you told stories. And
Oh, I'm glad.
You alluded to this earlier, this idea of telling stories. How is telling stories important both as a teacher and an author?
I think it's of utmost importance. I think I got this from my piano teacher, who was an amazing mentor to me. And she taught me piano, but she didn't just teach me piano. She taught me about piano, she taught me about music, she taught me about teaching, and she taught me about life. And she did it by telling stories all the time. And the stories were relevant to the piano, but they also came from life. So in all my books and in all my teaching, I tell stories from life to illustrate the mathematical point and to make a connection with the human beings who are in front of me. Because math is fundamentally an abstract. It's separated from real life. That's the whole point of math, is it's removed from real life. So how do we get anyone to feel something about it? Well, I tell stories about life, because then it's something that we can relate to. But it's not, and here's my favorite ridiculous story problem that one of my friends posted on Facebook from her child's homework. It was this: you have 1 meter of string. You use 35 centimeters of it to tie up Eddie, and then you use 0.3 of it to tie up Joe. How much do you have left to tie up Sally? And aside from the question of why we're tying people up in the first place, 35 centimeters is not a very long piece of string to tie someone up with. So it's not that we're trying to apply it into stories of life, it's that we're using aspects of life to understand aspects of mathematics and to show that we do parts of mathematical thinking in our life all the time. And that if we tell a story is a journey, really. It's a journey from where you are now emotionally to where we want someone to be emotionally. And when we're teaching, that's what we need to do. We need to get people from the place that they're at to the place where we would like them to be. And we have to understand that they are starting from the place that they're starting at. We can't just pretend that they're starting somewhere else or wish that they knew something else. We have to take them from the place that they're actually at to the place that we want them to go. And so that is a story, it's a journey. And for me, the best way to do it is with feelings. Because if you do it just intellectually, then it kind of won't stick, because the emotions will still be over there. So we have to do it. I try to lead with the emotions, and then the intellectual part will follow.
Yeah, in my class, there's always this temptation for me to say, oh, let's work on some story problems. And a while ago, I stopped referring to them as stories or problems, and we just call them tasks now. This is a task that we've been asked to do. Let's work on this task. Because I didn't want it to sound like it was a problem that there was some sort of problem with it, or that it was actually telling a story. It's just more of a task. In terms of you telling stories in your book, I'm interested in the part where you start this question, do baby carrots exist? And I want to know, what do baby carrots have to do with infinity?
Baby carrots are my favorite ludicrous application of a very serious mathematical theorem called the intermediate value theorem, which is what you usually learn when you're in maybe first year calculus or something. And I think I can see some of my 160 students over there. We did it in the intermediate value theorem. And the intermediate value theorem says that baby carrots exist. So this happened because I was having furious argument with a mathematician at a conference about whether baby carrots are real. And I had not lived in this country yet at this time, so I had not seen baby cut carrots. In England, baby carrots are actually small carrots that haven't grown yet. And when I was little, we grew carrots in the garden. And because I'm very impatient, I would dig them up before they were fully grown, so they would be about this big. And they were a whole carrot. They happened to be this big. They had all the green poppily ends on, so it was definitely a carrot. Whereas now I see baby cut carrots, and they're very unnervingly cylindrical, and they're clearly fake. And so now I understand. Now I understand why this person didn't think that baby carrots were real, but I've used the intermediate value theorem to prove they must exist. Because what it says is that if the carrot had to start somewhere, and so it started when it was this 0 big, and it eventually gets this big, so at some point in between it must have been this big, if it grew continuously. So of course the mathematician came up with a counterexample and said, well, how do you know it wasn't sort of green goo until it was this big and then it spontaneously turned into a carrot? But I also used this during a critique panel. So one of the things we do at the Art Institute is that all faculty of all subjects take part in critiquing students' artwork every semester, and it's an amazing opportunity. I feel very privileged that as part of my math job, I get to go and critique art for students. And there was a student, and I hope she won't mind me talking about this because it was so interesting. She was saying that she was trying to find the sweet spot in between reality and created reality. And so she wanted to find something where she could get the viewers to be very unsure about whether her piece was real or whether it was a digital recreation of something. But she was having trouble finding the sweet spot. And so I said, well, you could use the intermediate value theorem, which says that over here, you start with something that's obviously created. And then over there, you have something that's obviously, well, this is real, and something here that's obviously a digital fabrication. And then you do various things in between, and somewhere in the middle, there will be the sweet spot. You just don't necessarily know where it is. And it may be in a different place for everybody. And so that, for me, is another application of the intermediate value theorem, which has only been proved once mathematicians understood infinity.
That's a lot to take in.
Yes, it is.
But I liked it a lot, and I think that it was so powerful for me to hear this idea that talking to artists in a critique situation that there are things that you can offer in terms of mathematics as a way of thinking about it to help you build understanding. You also talked that part of it was this idea of reality and creating, but it reminded me of something that I heard you say once about like critical thinking. I oftentimes try to not use the phrase critical thinking in my classroom. I try to use creative thinking. Mm-hmm. What is it about critical thinking that you have said before?
It's one of my pet peeves. I think that critical thinking is one of those things where I think the adjective is redundant. Because all thinking, if thinking isn't critical, it's not thinking. And if it's not critical, then I think that we should qualify that. It should be called, stupid thinking or something. Something very non-judgmental like that.
Yeah. When I picked up this book and started to go through it and read it, I read maybe, the first couple of chapters, and then I started flipping through it because I was like, where's Dinos Paradox? Because that's my favorite little bit of infinity storytelling. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us about Dinos Paradox?
Yeah, there are 3 of Dinos Paradoxes. My favorite one is the one that says that your chocolate cake can go on forever because you eat half of it, and then you eat half of what's left, and then you eat half of what's left, and then you eat half of what's left, and so on, and so on, and so it will go on forever. Of course, in reality, it becomes so small that you can't see it anymore, or it's smaller than my mouth or something. But I like the idea that my chocolate cake can go on forever. And Zeno didn't, of course, actually talk about it in terms of chocolate cake. He should have done. But He was 2,000 years ago. I don't think they had chocolate cake yet. But he talked about it in terms of traveling. So he said, if you're trying to get from here to here, you have to cover half the distance. And then you have to cover half the remaining distance. And then you have to cover half the remaining distance. And half the remaining distance. Oh, no! Does that mean you'll never get there? And of course, we do get to places. You all got here today. I get to my fridge many times a day. And so we know that that's not true, but where has the logic gone wrong inside there? So it's one of those paradoxes where we appear to have used logic to contradict reality. And then you can do several things. You can throw up your hands and go, well, that means that logic's really dumb. And that's not what mathematicians do. Mathematicians go, ooh, a paradox, that's really exciting. It's like an optical illusion. So I love optical illusions, and I love staring at them and the illusion continuing and not really knowing why. And I love even when it's been explained that the illusion will still happen. Like that one that you have overlapping grids and the 2 things are the same color of gray, but one of them looks much darker than the other because it's represented as a shadow or something, and so one of them's the real thing, and it's shown in sunlight, so you think it must be darker because sunlight is shining on it, and it's still so bright, something like that. Or the one where dots appear, or where you shake your head a bit and everything moves around the side. I love all of those illusions. And Dinos Paradox is one of those illusions where you think, wait, I have to cover an infinite number of distances. How can I do that? But it was a genuine question that they wanted to fix, because if we believe that we can understand things by logic, then we should be able to explain that. Of course, some people have no desire to use logic ever, but I'm not like that. And so the fix came thousands of years later, where we understood that if we do an infinite number of things, that's okay if they're infinitely small. And if they get infinitely smaller and we add them up, then something can be understood about it. And another version of Zeno's paradox, or another paradox, is where he has a tortoise and Achilles run a race. And you say, well, the tortoise gets a head start. But then by the time that Achilles has got to the place where the tortoise started, the tortoise must have got a little bit further ahead. But then by the time that Achilles has got there, then the tortoise has still got a little bit further ahead. And by the time Achilles has got here, the tortoise has still got a little bit further. And then, of course, Achilles does win the race, definitely. So what is it that's going on there? And I was reminded of this by one of the great videos that appears on the internet sometimes, which is, I think, what the internet should be all about. Videos like the hare, the rabbit, and the tortoise. They did a real race of a rabbit against a tortoise. And it was perfect because the tortoise just kind of went like this. And the rabbit went, ga-ding, 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 ga-ding. And then he got halfway along, and then he kind of went, oh, what's over here? Oh, what's over here? Oh, what's over here? And then the tortoise just carried on plodding all the way there, and the rabbit never made it to the end. But so that reminded me of infinity. So if I tell a story like that in class while talking about infinity, then it links infinity by some slightly strange circuitous route to rabbits. And then maybe the next time you see a rabbit, you'll think of infinity a little bit. And what that means is that there isn't such a strong boundary between the math part of your brain and the rest of your brain. And one of the problems I'm sure you've had in class as well is that students come into math class and they turn on their math brain. And then math class ends and they leave and they go, phew, I can turn off my math brain now. And so math becomes a subject rather than a discipline that you can apply to the whole rest of your life. And if you make connections to outside of the classroom, then it just means that something might trigger that thought while you're outside of the classroom. And then now my students sometimes say to me, now every time I see cookies, I think of infinity. And I'm not sure if they think that's a good thing or not, but I think it's a great thing.
This idea of taking mathematical ideas or mathematical thinking outside of a classroom or outside of a teaching and learning environment and applying it to your everyday experience or the world around you to help you both understand the world and make meaning of the world is very interesting to me. And as I was reading the book, you bring up this thing called the Axiom of Choice and decision fatigue. Could you tell us a little bit about what the Axiom of Choice is?
The axiom of choice is quite profound, and it's one of those things that sometimes people regale me with when they're trying to show how clever they are, which people do sometimes. They say, oh, well, what do you think about the axiom of choice? And what it says is that what it comes down to is decision fatigue. So decision fatigue is this idea that after making a certain number of choices during the day, you get tired of it. And it doesn't matter how big or small the choice is. So it can be whether to buy this house, or it can be what to eat for breakfast. Each of those decisions makes you tired. And they did studies where they showed that when judges were passing sentences on people, if they'd already made a certain number of judgments, then different things happened. And then if they took a break and ate lunch, then they came back and started again, then they had less decision fatigue. So you might think it's just about fatigue, but it's really about the number of decisions that you make. And mathematically, this comes up by saying you can make a finite number of decisions, but you can't mathematically make an infinite number of decisions, or can you? So this is the question. The axiom of choice is an axiom that says you can, and it can't be proved. So the point about an axiom in mathematics is it's a thing that you can't prove. You just have to take it to be true and see what happens. And we do a lot of that in math. We just explore worlds. We say, what if I start with these truths? What will then follow from that? Or what if I start with these ones? And we know as mathematicians that you can't start with nothing. If you start with 0 things and you deduce stuff from it, you'll only get 0 things. You can't deduce things from nothing. So you have to take something as your starting point. And the axiom of choice is a thing that you can take as a starting point, saying, no, it's not possible to make an infinite number of choices. Or you can say, yes, it is possible. And then you've embraced the axiom of choice. And we don't know, we can't say that one is true and one isn't true. So math isn't about right and wrong, actually. It's not about there being a right answer. There are some things where we have proved that it is not possible to know the answer, which I think is amazing. And so as a result, all we can do is examine what happens if you do take this thing to be true, as opposed to what happens if you do take this other thing to be true. And for me, that is how mathematical thinking sheds light on the world and human behavior, because it means that I am able to say, well, this is what happens if you take this thing to be true, and this is what happens if you take this other thing to be true. Now we can discuss which one we think is better for the world, but we can't just dig in our heels and say that this one is true. We need to have a discussion about it.
This idea of thinking about what is the thing that is true and defining something as true and then moving on from there reminds me of my teacher training and having to really get into this idea of cardinal numbers and thinking about how small children and people who are learning about math and counting and that this idea of what cardinal numbers are, and I'm just fascinated by them, and it becomes a big piece of defining infinity in the book. So could you talk a little bit about like the importance of cardinal numbers?
So ordinal and cardinal numbers are two slightly different ways of understanding infinity using numbers. And they're slightly different though, because cardinal numbers is just about size. So when we think about cardinality, it's just what size is the group of people in this room, where I don't really mind what order you arrived in. Whereas maybe I care what order you arrived in, because maybe the first 10 people are going to win a free book, and then it matters what order you came in. And that's ordinal numbers, and different infinities happen if you care what order people arrived in. So, for example, if you imagine that you're arriving for an event, we get to use our imagination now. So imagine an infinite number of people arriving for an event, and you hand them a raffle ticket for each time someone arrives, so that they have a number as they arrive. So the first person gets number 1, and so on. If you have an infinite number of people arriving, you use up your you have an infinite raffle book, and you use up that whole raffle ticket book, and then someone new arrives. You go, oh, well, I've run out of raffle tickets now. I have to start again with a new color. So maybe I'll use blue tickets now. So that's if you have an infinite number of people first, and then another person. Whereas, if that one person had arrived first, everything would be okay, because you use ticket number 1 for that one person, and then the infinite people can just use up the rest of your red raffle ticket book. And so that's telling us that when you're doing ordinal numbers, 1 plus infinity is not the same as infinity plus 1. And I like to think this is why Shakespeare said in The Taming of the Shrew, forever and a day, because he knew that forever and a day is longer than forever. Otherwise, he'd just have said forever. So I like to think he was doing ordinal numbers at that point. I'm not really quite sure that's what he was doing. That's my story. Whereas in cardinal numbers, infinity plus 1 is the same as 1 plus infinity, because you just have all the people at once, and that first person goes at the front, and then you have all the rest of the people. So with cardinal numbers, to get a bigger infinity, you have to do 2 to the power of infinity. Whereas with ordinal numbers, with the raffle tickets, you can, infinity plus 1 is bigger, infinity plus 2 is bigger, infinity times infinity is bigger, 2 times infinity is different from infinity times 2, and so on.
We're at the point where we can open it up for questions from the audience, so we'll do that for about 15 minutes.
Hi!
Hey.
When I was much, much younger, I taught 6th grade, then 5th grade, then 4th grade. And it didn't matter what grade level I was at. I had young females who just did not like math. Is that a genetic thing, a gender thing? Do you have any comments on why that seems to happen?
How long have we got? So I have many theories about this. Thank you for bringing that up, because we, in fact, didn't end up talking about it. But I believe that, well, first of all, I'm a female person, and I'm really good at math. And so there are several of my students here who are female, and they're really good at math too. And so anyway, of course, that's a very small sample size. But here's the thing that I think, which is that we should stop thinking about it as a gender issue, and we should think about character traits instead. And so if you heard me talking on WBEZ the other day, you heard me say that I've invented some new words. And that's ingressive and congressive. Ingressive to replace masculine and congressive to replace feminine. And the idea is that ingressive is a character trait where it's a behavior, where it's about going forward, it's about not being waylaid by what people say, it's about being competitive and winning. Congressive is about bringing things together and about shedding light and understanding and helping people. And maybe more men are ingressive and more women are congressive. And maybe we are presenting mathematics at school in a very ingressive way, because it's often about being right and about getting the right answer. And what I've realized about myself is that I'm not interested in being right. And some of you, my friends in the audience, might be surprised about this, but what I don't like losing. I'm not interested in winning at all, but I hate losing and I don't like being wrong. And so I will get competitive, but not because I'm trying to win, only because I'm desperately trying not to lose. But if it's a situation where nobody is going to lose because we're all trying to understand something together, then there's no risk of losing, and then we can all gain from it. And that's why I'm not interested in playing sport at all. First of all, because I'm terrible at it, but secondly, because I hate the idea of losing, and I'm not interested in winning. So there's no upside, and there's only potential downside. And I see this with students, that some students will shout out the answer in class because they're not afraid of being wrong and they love the idea of being right. Whereas other students won't want to say anything in class, and I never said anything in class when I was an undergraduate. I would never have said anything because I'm not that interested in being shown to be right, but I hate the idea of being shown to be wrong. And if you hate the idea of being wrong and being told you're wrong, then you get put off math at a very early age because it's the one subject where you start being told you're wrong a lot. And then if you're told you're wrong and you don't like that, then you'll move off into some subject where it's more creative and you can create things. And math, unfortunately, is presented in this very ingressive way, despite the fact that when you get to a research level, it's very congressive. And I think there are many fields where we use ingressive means to filter people, despite the fact that congressive characteristics would be more useful in the end. And that's the thing that I would like to change. So with math in particular, a lot of programs for good mathematicians at a young age are things like competitions and big problem-solving things and Olympiads. And that is very ingressive. And I sat in on one of these competitions in Italy, as it happens, and it was for 11 and 12-year-olds, and there was basically an equal number of boys and girls. And the person who ran it said to me, yeah, it's great, and unfortunately, when we do it again for 14 and 15-year-olds, it's mostly boys. And she said, I don't really understand why. And I thought, I do, I think. Well, at least I have a theory. And so I think I love to focus on how to make mathematical activities more congressive instead of ingressive. So when I'm teaching art students, I do a lot of activities where there is no right and wrong. And we're not trying to achieve an answer, we're trying to explore. And so we build something, it's more craft-like. So there are math activities that are more craft-like, and there are some that are more like games where you're trying to win. And for congressive people, the craft-like ones are better. And so we explore things, and maybe we're trying to build platonic solids, but it doesn't really matter if you didn't build something, because the platonic solid, because you built something else. And along the way, we discover how triangles fit together, and we discover how versatile an equilateral triangle is as a building block, and that you can make all sorts of shapes out of triangles, and some of them are platonic solids. And if we get those, then great, we've discovered a platonic solid. And if we don't, well, it doesn't matter, we've built something else, and that everyone can explore those things. And I believe in the world of pedagogy, this is called low floor, high ceiling activities, where there's a very low floor to entry, very high ceiling, so that if someone does want to go really far, they can. But then there's no real failure, because everyone has done something. And I think if we do more of that, then we will stop putting off congressive people from mathematics.
Wondering if you saw the movie Hidden Figures about the women who were mathematicians and engineers who helped put the men reach the moon.
I have not yet seen it, and I hope to see it or possibly read the book. I haven't had very much time for seeing movies recently. I've been traveling like mad, but I hear it's very good, and I'm very glad that those stories are being told, because there are many cases where women, or dare I say it, congressive people, their stories are not heard because we reward ingressive behavior in society. We reward the person who is at the forefront, and we don't reward the people who help. Whereas in fact, it wouldn't have been possible without all the people who help. And also, congressive people tend not to put themselves forward for the recognition, and so they don't get recognized. And so one of the things I'd like to work on is how congressive people can be heard in an ingressive world without having to emulate ingressive behavior. And so I can do it. If someone gets ingressive at me, I can get ingressive right back, and I'll be really good at it. And I'll go home and hate myself afterwards, because I don't like being like that. And so I'm developing ways that I can respond congressively even in an ingressive world. And in fact, the very fact that I'm here is part of that, because I realized that in my former job in the UK, it was requiring me to be more ingressive than I wanted to. And so I looked at myself and thought about what I'm good at and the way in which I want to contribute to society, which is a congressive behavior, I think. And I decided I could contribute more if I did things differently, and if I quit my tenured job, and I did more public work, and all of this and this book, it's not because I wanted to write a book, and it's not because I wanted to go on the radio, or I want to be on a stage, it's because I want to talk to people, and I want to reach people, and that is a congressive activity, and that's why I'm here, and that is what is motivating me.
So this can be to either of you, since you both teach. As a teacher, we have these conversations about, do you teach through specific examples and then discuss the overarching principle? Or do you discuss the overarching principle to lead into them figuring out the details? And if you're trying to teach a skill that is essential, some people say, I can't talk about the big picture, I just need to see it done a couple times and then I'll piece it together. But sometimes those students simply learn how to repeat it, and they don't understand the context, the when, the if. This is the case when you do use this. Where are you as a teacher in terms of big picture to improving the skills versus skills to see the big picture?
Well, the thing that's difficult about teaching is that everyone is different. Fancy that. And so different people need things to be taught to them in different ways. And one of the things that we need to do as teachers is really try to understand the people we have in front of us and understand what their needs are and understand what will best help them. And I'm very lucky at SAIC because my classes are really small. They're capped at 22, which means I can get to know everybody and understand what it is that they need. It's very hard when you have a large class. I used to teach classes of 150. And at that point, I had to try and do everything in the hope that someone would get something out of it. But what I always try to do is start with motivation. Because if my students don't care, they won't learn anything at all. And so the first thing I need to do is get them to care. And I think that that is often missing from math, especially in school. And one of the problems is that we try and get students to care by saying it's useful. But what young person ever got motivated to do something because it's useful? I like to say that's like introducing someone to someone and saying, I'd like you to meet my friend, he's really useful. Which does not make him sound interesting at all. And so instead, if we get people to understand why is this, to get them to care, and if they don't care, well, one of the problems can be that teachers are required to teach things that have been mandated by somebody else who wasn't thinking quite the same way. And so when I have had to teach things, I don't know if any of my 150 students are here, but you get to this point in the book where they make us do this thing, and I go, well, the thing is, I don't think this is very interesting. Should we just skip it? And you can learn this later if you ever need it, so we just started turning pages in the book until we found something interesting. Because I can't, if I don't find it interesting, if I don't see a reason, if I can't see a reason to do it, then I'll never be able to teach it to my students. But if I can see a reason, then I can have a hope of convincing my students what the point is. And if they see that there's a point, then they'll want to do it. And that motivation will be very different for different people. Some people might be interested by what the applications are and seeing it working. Some people might be interested just because it's really cool. There's something that I've been doing with my art students about factorizing numbers and constructing geometric shapes based on the factor structures. And they pushed it so much further than I ever dreamed of. And in fact, they started just spontaneously factoring numbers without me even asking them to. And they had never been in the slightest bit interested in factoring a number before in their whole life. But when it turned into a process of uncovering geometric shapes inside it and structures, then they became interested by it. So we really have to understand each individual, and of course that takes time and it takes resources. So then the first thing we should do is we should have more resources for education. We should respect and trust teachers enough that they will be able to teach the things that they believe in, and if we let them teach the things they believe in, then they'll do it better. That's what I think we should do.
So since you teach at the Institute, I'm curious how you would characterize, or maybe not same or different, mathematical imagination versus artistic imagination.
That's a very interesting question. I think imagination is all part of the same thing. And it depends what you think the starting point is. And of course, there are many different types of mathematical education, and there are many different types of artistic imagination as well. And for me, imagination comes from feeling rooted. So if I feel rooted, then I can be more imaginative with the other things, because I know that something isn't going to break. And if I have some starting point, if you just give me, my nephew handed me a pile of Lego and said, build something, and I kind of went, build what? What should I build? If he'd said build a car, then I could build a car. If he had build a robot, then I could build a robot. So for me, having some constraint is actually a really good starting point for imagination. And so having a mathematical starting point, for me, means that I know that I have to work within a certain system. And artists do that as well, because they pick a medium or they pick a subject, and then they decide to work within that. And I think that being able to think freely, imagination is about thinking freely. And I think that one of the reasons that children are very good at it, and then adults sometimes become bad at it, is because we become weighed down by the boring responsibilities of life. And children are not weighed down by those responsibilities. And that's great, and we should nurture it, and we should nurture the curiosity that comes with it. And then when we get older, I think that it's okay to be weighed down with the boring responsibilities of life, because otherwise we wouldn't, have food to eat, or we wouldn't be nice to other human beings and pay our taxes and things like that. But I think that if we understand which are the responsibilities and which are the things in which we can be free, then that helps us to be more imaginative. And so, for example, I think I'm quite good at finding imaginative solutions to actual life problems. And the way I do it is I really understand what is going on in a situation. And to me, this comes from mathematical thinking, because I really understand what's making a situation work. And I think of this as being, it's like when if you have a lot of resources, you don't have to do that. So if you have tons of money, you don't have to understand the situation. You just throw money at it and something will happen. Whereas it's much more kind of elegant to understand exactly how a situation is working, to understand exactly what you need to do, and then everything else can happen freely around it. That's what I think anyway.
Hi, first off, I'm a mathematician and I'm also female, so.
Woo!
But I recently read a book called The Golden Ratio, and it's about this number that shows up all over nature and sometimes in art. And the author kind of explores, are we forcing math into things that might not actually have math in them? So my question is, do you think that math can explain everything? Or is there some human qualities or just part of life that cannot be explained by math?
Thank you for that lovely question. I absolutely do not think that math can explain everything, and I do not think that we should even try to get math to explain everything. And I do think the golden ratio is one of the things that has been particularly forced in places that are not the golden ratio at all. But that's beside the point. For me, it's that every time we answer a mathematical question, it creates more questions. And from that alone, we know that we will never be able to answer all the questions. Just like we will never be able to find all the numbers, because there's always another one after we've found it. But for me, the aim isn't to explain everything using math and logic. The aim is to find what is the logical part in any given situation, and put as much into that logical part as possible. Because the logical part is the easy part. That's the part that works the way it's supposed to. Life is much messier than that, and much harder than that. So we'll never be able to explain the rest of it. But if we've put as much as possible in the logical part, we can save our most powerful resources of our brain for doing the part that's difficult, that's outside that, once we've sort of just put the easy part into the mathematical part. And for me, where is most interesting to me is the exact interface between the things we can explain using logic and the things that we can't quite. And so, for example, when a piece of music makes me cry, I'm fascinated by why it makes me cry, and I will analyze why it does, and I can analyze its chord structure and the chord progressions and the counter melodies, and I'll get to a certain point and I'll say, oh, it's that suspension right there that makes me cry. But why does that suspension make me cry? That's what I can't understand, and that is where the beauty of it is, to me, just beyond what we can explain. And so I have this image that the logical part of what we understand is at the central sphere of all of our understanding, and that the surface area is the interface between what we can and we can't understand, and that that logical core is like our physical core. If we have a strong core, we get more access to the rest of our thinking. And as we put more and more things into that logical core, the sphere grows, and so the surface area grows, and so that interface grows. And because that interface is where beautiful things are, we get more and more access to beautiful things.
So that's all the time we have for today. And let's have one more time for Eugenia Cheng.
Thank you very much.